Christianity really was, if one of the best educated, most widely traveled guys really doesn't know much about them, that kind of suggests that not many people did at this point in time.
At this time, it was a fringe movement.
So I have to disagree with Professor Aldrete completely on this section. It's a logical fallacy the moment you put it into context. Yeah, hey, noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. We are back, my friend. Oh, we are back. This is going to be a long episode. Now, I know that you guys really enjoyed my reactions and I would say expansions and contributions to the Gregory Aldrete, The Roman Empire Rise and Fall of Ancient Rome by Lex Fridman podcast, which is a fantastic episode. And even though we are responding to each and every single section piece by piece, I would still strongly suggest you to go check him out, watch the original video, and watch all of the rest of the podcasts that he presents, because of course Lex Fridman is a fantastic host. Now, these are the other episodes that I've covered so far. I've done 3, so make sure to check them out. I'll put links in the description, of course. But today we're talking religion in ancient Rome. This is going to be a big one.
Could we talk about the role of religion in the Roman Empire? What's the story there?
I mean, religion's interesting because, in my mind, the rise to dominance in a lot of the world of monotheistic religions is one of the huge sort of turning points, because it's just such a different mentality.
I agree with that.
I mean, it's very, very different where you say there's one God and it's my God versus, okay, I believe in this God, but there's an infinite number of legitimate gods. And nowadays, particularly in the West, we tend to view the monotheistic perspective as the norm. But for, more than half of human history, it was not.
That's a very good point. I like that because I enjoy when we look at things from the perspective of people in period rather than trying to interpret them from our perspective.
It used to be the notion in a lot of Roman history up until about 300 AD. The idea was, well, there's just a ton of gods floating around, and, maybe you worship that one, and I worship these two that I like, and the guy across the street worships the oak tree in his backyard, and it's all good. They're all legitimate things.
When it comes to they're all legitimate things, I would like to underline, however, that the Romans did consider their gods to be superior in the sense that, the Romans were, of course, aware that the Celts or Celtic cultures, for example, in Gaul, they had druids, they worshipped whatever they worshipped, but it's not like the Romans thought, they are equally legitimate as Jupiter, Minerva, and Neptunus. Absolutely not. And one thing that is important to underline with that is not necessarily a matter of complexity, because we might think, we are worshipping the anthropomorphic gods, but they're worshipping like a tree. Well, no, because the Celtic tradition is actually quite well structured, contrary to popular belief, in the sense that it wasn't just a matter of, the druids are worshipping the trees and that's the end of it. No, they had a doctrine, they had principles, and it was pretty regimented to the point that we know from Roman sources that the druids from Gaul would actually travel to Britannia to study from the druids in Britannia, because they considered them to be like a sort of, similar to an Erasmus or a study internship that we do today, but for their version. So the religion was actually quite complex in its own merit, but from the Romans' perspective, as long as you pay taxes, we don't care, worship whoever you want, but not equally legitimate in their mind. Let's keep in mind that Romans considered themselves to be superior and to be the masters of the world. Hence, their gods are superior too.
Says, no. Now there is one God and only one God that's the correct answer. And as soon as you do that, religion becomes foregrounded in your decision-making much more.
It already was, so I kind of disagree a little bit, but I want to let him speak. Maybe I'll come back to this.
I mean, the Romans had religion, but it wasn't really driving anything, if you know what I mean. It was.
No, that's like particularly when we are talking about Christianity, of course they're going to talk about Jesus, and Jesus was born under Emperor Augustus, and specifically under Augustus, religion was a massive driving force. I will defend this.
It was auxiliary to things rather than a central force. So for a lot of Roman history, you had a standard kind of, pagan polytheism where there's a bunch of gods. There's certain gods who are associated with the Roman state. And there would be prayers said to those gods on behalf of the Roman state, but it wasn't really, you weren't trying to execute the will of Zeus or something, or of Jupiter or Mars or anybody else. And in your private life, it was the same thing. You might ask certain gods for help, but it wasn't as much of a dominant thing in your own existence. So I think that's a real transition point where religion started to become so foregrounded. And as soon as you get the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in particular, it really shifts how people start to think about themselves in relationship to the world around them.
Well, once again, the Romans considered themselves to be the sons of Mars.
So Jesus was born during the rule of Emperor Augustus.
Yep. Which is kind of neat.
And died under Tiberius.
That, really influential people in the realm of political events and religious events coexisted. What are the odds?
I mean, yeah, there's certain moments in history where just a lot of interesting, powerful people come together and make history. And he was crucified under Emperor Tiberius' rule.
Yep.
I have a video dedicated to Jesus' crucifixion, by the way, link in the description.
And if you look at some of the primary sources of that time, I mean, there's this very famous letter by a guy named Pliny, who was a Roman governor of a province in the east, and he has the habit of writing letters to the Roman emperor at the time, who was Trajan, every time he had a problem with being governor. And so this is great. This is the two highest governmental officials in the Roman world sort of hammering out policy between them, right? The emperor and one of his governors. And so this is about 100 years, 100 AD about. And Pliny says, hey, emperor, I had this issue. I had these people come before me called Christians. I don't quite know what to do with them. What should my policy be? And here's what I know about them. And what he knows is almost nothing. I mean, it's this almost comic, like garbling, and they have this weird thing where they get together on some day of the week and they sort of swear oaths to one another not to do bad stuff, which is of course his garbled understanding of the Ten Commandments. And then they have breakfast together and they eat food, and this is communion, but he doesn't get that that's what's going on. And so he's really...
That is interesting, actually, to see, to look at it from his perspective.
But I think that the broader point is...
I don't know if he's ignorant. Well, yeah, I mean, sure.
Okay, this is one of the best educated, best traveled Romans who has the most experience in the empire, has been all over the empire. And what does he know about Christianity? Basically nothing. If one of the best educated, most widely traveled guys really doesn't know much about them, that kind of suggests that not many people did at this point in time.
At this time, it was a fringe movement.
In reality, Christianity, particularly in its early inception, was very, very popular with the lower strata or the most humble elements of society. So the fact that a statesman doesn't know much about it, or a governor, it doesn't automatically mean, oh, if he doesn't know, then no one would know. Because in fact, the reality is the opposite. I think the lower strata is where you're going to find the majority of the knowledge on. So I have to disagree with Professor Aldrete completely on this section. It's a logical fallacy the moment you put it into context. A thing that happened historically when it comes to the early spread of Christianity through the work of the apostles is that Christianity gained continuous consent from the most oppressed strata of society, which, I mean, it makes logical sense, doesn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, if you're a Roman governor, if you're a politician, or if you're a rich merchant, you're going to be less prone to the idea of changing or accepting a new religion, a new series of doctrine. But if you are people that are instead struggling in life, it is more realistic that they are going to be looking for hope or looking for something that can give them a different perspective on life. Moreover, one of the reasons why I specifically use the term the more humble strata of society, which, kind of connects also to the Christian principle when Jesus says, for a rich man it's going to be really hard to enter the kingdom of heaven. But this is not just something that we can document when it comes to the early spread of Christianity, but it is a pattern that will continue for centuries. In fact, even when we look all the way up to the 3rd century AD, 300 years after the birth of Christ, as the taxes progressively increase, creating a higher fiscal burden on the productive elements of society, so farmer and agricultural sector, this caused outbreaks and rebellions, and these rebels tended to also join Christianity. Just to give you some names, I'm talking about population revolts in Gaul, province of Africa, discontent in the Near East. I'm talking about the Bagaudae, Kirkunkeliones, and Maratokupureni, if you want to look them up to kind of further research and double check on the information I'm presenting. All of these rebels, they were parts of farmers, massive discontent, social discontent, tax burden, they become Christians. And therefore, just to stress that point, just because a governor or the emperor are not knowledgeable of Christianity, no, I think that there were definitely elements in Roman society, in the lower strata, that were very familiar with Christianity, and in fact would have understood it much more than the elites.
Why were the ideas of Jesus seen as a threat by the emperor?
The thing that causes conflicts between the Romans and Christians is a little bit strange. It's all with this, where the Romans had a tradition of, on the emperor's birthday, sort of saying a prayer, basically wishing him good luck. Okay, but technically it's in the form of sacrificing to that part of the emperor that might become divine after his death. So to the Romans, this is the equivalent of a patriotism act.
Maybe. I wouldn't say it's an equivalent to a patriotism act, because a patriotism act is a secular act and it does not necessarily have such a strong connection to religion, whereas for the Romans, the emperor is absolutely religious and secular. It's connected.
Saying, the Pledge of Allegiance or something to the country. But of course, to Christians, this is worshiping another god. And I think there's almost a failure of communication here.
That's the part that I disagree. I don't think there is any failure of communication between early Christians and Roman imperial authorities. I will defend this as well in a little bit.
That the Romans just, at least initially, didn't quite understand this is really problematic for these people because they're coming from a polytheistic perspective.
Very flawed. Apologies. I'm not disrespecting, of course, Professor Aldrete. Feel free to disagree with me, by the way, but I am sharing my opinion here. I think this is a flawed way to approach this, because the way you are describing it, Professor Aldrete, unless I am misunderstanding you, is that you're saying that, well, the Romans being polytheistic, they didn't really understand this thing about Christians that were monotheistic, and they weren't okay with showing respect and prayers and sacrifices for the emperor. But they knew it's not like Christians were the first monotheistic religions. The Jewish were monotheistic and had been for a while, for a long time, in fact. What that means is that the Romans were absolutely used to the idea of, well, people in the province of Judea are monotheistic. They knew that, with or without Christianity, the advent of Christianity. So this isn't a new thing for the Romans. Moreover, it's also important to underline that the Romans did not most likely perceive early Christians as being a separate religion. That's a little bit of a modern take, because now we take it for granted. But for the Romans, they probably viewed early Christians as just a sect within Jewish tradition or Judaism. And the way I'm going to defend this is because at the end of the day, it's not like the Romans were that interested into understanding all the minutiae of the doctrine, comprehending deeply the way these religions functioned. So, for example, we all know that Buddhism is a thing, we all know what it is, and we have an overall marginal understanding of what a Buddhist, usually like a monk, looks like. How many of you, without using Google, can quote a sutra right now, or could explain in details the difference between Mahayana Buddhism and Hinayana Buddhism? And I mean, the differences are massive. There are some aspects of Buddhism that don't believe the Buddha is a god, and others think he is a universal god. So it's huge. In the same way, yes, the differences between early Christianity and the Jewish tradition were big, but to the Romans, it most likely was all, well, religions from that region and that area of the empire.
Yeah, everybody has different gods, so what? This isn't a religious problem. This is a political one. That why won't you wish, send good wishes to the emperor? If you're a loyal Roman, this is something you should want to do.
They are connected. They are extremely connected. Politics and religion are connected. The idea of, for example, the distinction between church and state, even in the Middle Ages, didn't make sense. Like, if you would try to explain that to a medieval person, they would be like, what do you mean? But even more so with Emperor Octavianus Augustus. Emperor Augustus was extremely involved in Roman religion. Historical records tell us that he restored up to 82 temples. Part of his policies were to restore the tradition of Rome, and therefore the ritualistic aspects of everything that had to do with the Roman religion was brought back and represented to the public through him. As early as 12 AD, he made himself Pontifex Maximus, which means he was the chief priest of Rome. That's the highest priest of the land. There is also the whole situation with Halley's Comet, that it just so happened that during his early reign, you had this massive comet in the sky, and he used that saying, oh, that's the spirit of Julius Caesar, who is his father, remember, adoptive father, and he's now going up to the gods, and he's becoming a god himself. Therefore, that was called part of political propaganda, because that made him son of God. something Christians might have not appreciated. Then he even had the Senate declare him to be a living god. So the connection of religion and politics, particularly during the reign of Augustus, are massive. And the fact that Christians would have had a problem with that is not a matter of a communication misunderstanding. No, they knew exactly what this was.
And many of the early Christians, I think, would have been fine with that. But it took the form of what they were asked to do was to basically worship another god. And that was the sticking point.
I agree.
And this is where I think movies have kind of warped some of our images of Roman history, that Hollywood loves to depict very early Christians, and I'm talking like first 200 years here after the ministry of Christ, as a group that all the Romans were obsessed with, that they were constantly trying to persecute and all this. And honestly, I think the Romans at that point were more just sort of indifferent or didn't know what was going on. Yeah, very fringe. I mean, it was one of, hundreds of little mystery religions the Romans sort of thought of them as. And these are, religions that have some sort of revealed knowledge and that make more personal appeals to people. Now, stepping back from this in a broad way, I think you can say that Christianity really was different in some ways and had some things that maybe the Romans should rightfully have viewed as a threat. I mean, the Romans are people very focused on this world, right? Citizenship, what you do. Christianity, in essence, has a focus on the next world. So this world isn't as important as what you're setting yourself up for.
Well, for a Christian, what you do in this world is what's going to set you up for the next. But then again, I don't want to be too nitpicky. I'm pedantic, I know that.
And even worse, from a Roman perspective, I'm kind of saying, okay, if I were a Roman, Romans are all about making distinctions between people. Citizen, non-citizen. Man, woman, free, slave. Christianity comes along and says, in God's eyes, you're all equal. Now, that's a pretty problematic idea if you're deeply invested in Roman hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep... I understand where he's coming from. I don't want to be the guy that is going to nitpick on everything. I understand where he's coming from. But we do know that the Romans were very open when it comes to religion. And I'm going to say something very controversial now, and I mean, it is what it is. I'll just tell it how it is, and I say what I think. But from the perspective of the Roman Empire, a Christian subject would be preferable over a Jewish subject. Why? Of course, not because of anti-Semitism, not because of racial hatred, no, but simply because, as the professor said, Christians weren't particularly focused on this kingdom. In fact, my kingdom is not of this world, and also give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar as one of the principal elements. And now, I believe in the historical persona of Christ. But I understand that there will be some people in the audience who will tell me, no, I don't think historical Jesus existed. Even if you believe that, we'll have to agree to disagree. But even if you don't believe that Christ actually existed, and so you don't think that those words were actually uttered by Christ, it's still what the Christians would have believed. So it makes zero difference. Even if we have a point of disagreement, we can still both find common ground in agreeing that, okay, but the Christians did believe that those were the words of God, in the sense that Jesus Christ, the Master, said, when asked specifically when talking about taxes, which is, of course, paying your taxes to the Gentiles, to foreign enemy that is conquering us. The Jewish weren't very happy with that. Then they tried to trick Jesus and make him say something that all Jewish people didn't like anyways, which was the idea of, oh no, we shouldn't give money to Caesar. They wanted him to say it. He read the deception and he stated what basically every Roman statesman wants to hear. To Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. That is very much preferable from the perspective of a Roman emperor, as opposed to the general way in which the Jews and Jewish people approached the situation of Roman rule. As a proof of that, look at 60 or 70 AD, when you had all of the Romano-Jewish wars, when the Jews rebelled against Rome, and you have all the, and then they have to send all the legions. So yeah, that's not something that happens out of the blue, and that's definitely not something that the Romans weren't aware of, that it was a possibility. Therefore, I state again, from the perspective of a Roman, a Christian subject would have been preferable over a Jewish subject, precisely because of the core principles of the doctrine. And secondly, the Romans were quite open-minded as long as you didn't cause trouble and paid your taxes. They wouldn't go there and look at your minutiae. What do you believe exactly? No.
And I think it is no surprise that among the earliest converts to Christianity are women and slaves, and in particular, female slaves. Now,
and farmers, and in general, the lower strata society.
Now, who are they? They're the people at the rock bottom of the Roman hierarchy of status, right? Which the Romans are obsessed with status. But here's a religion that says that doesn't matter. And in that same letter to Pliny, Pliny says, okay, in this group of Christians I've heard about, their leaders are 2 female slaves they call deaconesses. Now, this is really early. This is before the church exists, right? There's no church structure yet. And
I think there would have been. There was a church structure even from the very concept of the 12 apostles, I would say, Peter and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, church history, we might end up disagreeing on a few points.
who is leading the local congregation of Christians? 2 slave women. So that's an interesting moment, and that's not necessarily the image we get of early Christianity. But you can see how for people in this social structure, that would be very appealing to them. And in some ways, yeah, it is sort of a threat to the Roman system because they're challenging it. Now, the irony is, of course...
I'm not sure that they would be leading, though. Sorry if it took me a second to... Because I was still thinking, what does he mean by leading? 2 women leading the congregation? I think that's a stretch.
300 years after the life of Christ, the emperor converts to Christianity, and another 100 years later under Theodosius, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, Constantine is I hope he focuses a little on Constantine, because we usually tend to focus on Theodosius, which, of course, it's absolutely important, consolidating and everything, but I always like to really focus on what Constantine did. He's the one that I like studying the most when it comes to the approach and the conversion to Christianity.
So all of a sudden you have this flip-flop where now the state itself is not just converted to Christianity, but actively promoting it, and now persecuting pagans.
Because I don't remember a specific legislation. I looked into them. I don't remember a specific legislation that made paganism illegal under Theodosius. I think that's what he's saying. But again, take this with a pinch of salt, because it's not like I read every single piece of legislation. I think I would have remembered that. I don't remember that. But do let me know in the comments if you're like, oh no, he's right on this one, and this is the piece of legislation. It was indeed illegal. I don't think it was, because I don't remember this piece of legislation.
The reason the emperors do that is one of the biggest problems for emperors at that point in time is legitimacy. That there's tons...
Yeah, that's why all that situation with Augustus that I talked about, it was absolutely about legitimacy, as it has been in many different cultures within the Mediterranean basin. It's not the only one.
Of civil wars where you have lots of different people saying, I'm emperor. So lots of generals declaring themselves emperor. Now, under a polytheistic religion, that's just, you're all just fighting, it doesn't matter. But if you say there is only one God, then if that God picks someone to be his emperor, they're the only legitimate emperor, right?
I understand the position, but then again, it contradicts what Augustus did. Augustus did that. Of course, he didn't say, Jupiter chose me. He didn't say that. I mean, it could have, and Jupiter is still the father of the gods. So yeah, if Jupiter chooses you, I mean, I'm saying from a political perspective, if you want to say that, hey, Jupiter chose me, and then someone else says, yeah, but I was chosen by Mars, I'm like, yeah, okay, but Jupiter is Jupiter, so it trumps it. I mean, even in a polytheistic situation, that can work. Moreover, Augustus went a step further and he said, no, I am a god. I'm the son of God and I'm a god. And that's something that can absolutely happen in polytheistic. So this is probably the episode I'm disagreeing with the professor the most. Look at the Egyptians. The pharaoh was a god. He said, I'm a god, polytheistic, still. If someone comes and says, well, yeah, you may be a god, but Isis likes me more, it doesn't work like that. It is making it sound like only under a monotheistic religion can you declare you are the chosen of God. But that's absolutely not true. And we know that for a fact. Again, look at the Egyptians. You don't even have to look at the Romans. You don't even have to look at the Greeks, even though you will find examples. But the Egyptians, it was constantly in connection with religion, and it was constantly either I'm chosen by a god or I am God. So, polytheism absolutely works for that. It does.
So there is a real advantage to emperors now becoming Christian, because if they can say, we're now a Christian empire, and there's only one God, and I'm the guy that God picked to be emperor, that means all these other people claiming to be emperors are illegitimate.
Do you think that...
If that were the case, then you wouldn't have any situation such as having multiple popes in medieval history, because what? It did happen, and they were both claiming to be the chosen one and by God and the vicar of Christ. One in France, one in Rome. It did happen. 100% disagree. Sorry, Professor.
Or is there other factors that explain why Christianity was able to spread?
Well, I mean, that's why it's appealing to the emperors. And we're talking here, I mean, the religious answer is people see the light, right? It's a faith-based thing. I'm looking at this as a historian.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Putting aside,
As a Christian, I respect that.
religious feeling and saying, okay, if I'm doing an analysis of this as a social phenomenon, what would be appealing to people? And there is that very compelling reason for emperors to want to go to Christianity because it helps them with their biggest problem, which is legitimacy.
Yeah, literally any religion does. Any religion does. Once again, Augustus did it.
If you're an ordinary person, what is the appeal of Christianity? Well, we already looked at a couple of them.
Yeah.
One of them is that, it promises you a reward in the afterlife.
Yeah.
I mean, the Roman and Greek notions of the
So do the Old Norse religions.
afterlife aren't that appealing. Either you just sort of turn into dust, or at best you turn into this kind of ghost thing that floats around something that looks like a Greek gymnasium, which is like a bunch of grassy fields. It's not so hot.
From your perspective, I think the idea of Elysium, for example, was very appealing for a Roman. So this is a little bit of a skewed perspective.
So here you're offered the idea of like, oh, you go to paradise forever. That sounds really good. And secondly, for a lot of people in Roman society, that notion of here's something that says I'm valuable as a human being. It doesn't matter whether I'm free or slave. It doesn't matter whether I'm Roman or non-Roman.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if I'm man or woman. Here's something that says I have equal value. That's enormously appealing. And finally, early Christians, I mean, they honestly, a lot of them do good works. They take care of the sick. They feed the poor. I mean, if you look at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, that's the stuff he really hammers. If we look at, the words of Jesus when he says, what do you do to be a Christian? A lot of it is take care of the unfortunate. Take care of people who are sick, take care of people who are starving. And a lot of the early Christians really take that seriously. So they are helping people out. So that's appealing.
They're the good kind of populist, and populist messages spread. Let me ask you about gladiators.
Oh, okay. So that's probably going to be a different episode, I imagine, since gladiators, I love the topic of gladiators. I have a lot to say about gladiators. So I imagine this concludes the section on religion. As I say, probably the section where I have disagreed the most with Professor Aldrete, but as always, this is not an attack on him personally. This is just, expressing my ideas and attacking the argument and then presenting counter-arguments to justify the disagreements or the points of disagreement that I presented on this episode. As always, of course, let's be respectful. I really enjoyed the episode. I think, as always, that Lex presented interesting questions and asked interesting questions and interesting follow-up questions, and this was an overall enjoyable episode. And in general, this entire 443 Roman Empire episode dedicated within the podcast has been absolutely fantastic. So massive thanks to you for watching until the end. Thanks for Professor Aldrete to join and share his opinions, even though I disagreed with the majority today. And massive thanks, as always, to Lex Fridman for running the show. And of course, last but not least, thanks to all of you noble ones. And if you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to my channel and becoming a noble one. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.